Good morning, everyone. Wasn't a trick question. Good morning, everyone. Great to be here with you and to be on this fabulous panel. Sorry I can't see half of the room. I'll maybe turn myself a little so I can engage with all of you. But really, we're here to engage with our fabulous panelists. We've heard today from Des, from Tessie, from Doug about some of the issues that we face in our global cities. But there was something Tessie said about the city we dream about. And I think that's why we're all here, about how do we make that city we dream about a reality. And this conversation is about the role that business and the private sector have in making that happen. So I'm going to get right into it. Question is, we know the issues, and as Desmond said, we have to be courageous and name them, whether it's income inequality, issues around sustainability, discrimination in its many forms, anti-Black racism, or issues faced by our Indigenous brothers and sisters. We know business needs to be part of the solution and that business is part of the solution. What I would like to start us off is, could you each give me one concrete example of where you're really excited, where you see business really turning the dial in the right direction around these issues our global cities face?
On? Yeah. Good morning, everyone. So we actually have a great example at CCAB. So CCAB is a nonprofit national organization that works to bring businesses together with Indigenous communities and Indigenous. In the Suncor, as an example, in the oil sands in Fort McMurray, so Suncor has set a target of 5% of their procurement spend to go to Indigenous businesses and communities. So Suncor spends $15 billion a year, and this year they will have $650 million spent with Indigenous businesses and communities. So they're about $100 million short of their target of 5%. And we see the impact on the communities around Fort McMurray, the Mikisew Cree partnerships, from that spend. The average income in Mikisew Cree is close to $75,000 a year of net income, which compared to the average income in Alberta, which is about $50,000, and the average income in Canada, which is a little less than $40,000. So we see a direct impact on the community. The great thing about that is that money that goes to Indigenous businesses and communities goes back into the community. So it goes to an elder center, it goes to wastewater treatment, it goes to clean water. So you see an impact right towards the community from supporting those businesses and working with those businesses.
Well, thank you for the question. I think the examples I would use really draw on the map that was up on the big screen a minute ago. What I really see with the companies that we fund at STTC, and we fund about we have about 120 companies that we work with across the country, from small communities to large communities, is where they're developing, employing people, and developing their products for, most often for export globally. But what we really see is an overlap of data and environmental technologies. And that goes from the big scale to the small scale to the extreme to the very local. And I'll maybe, with permission, go a little bit more than one example. So the first thing I would say is, by city block or across a region now, you can think about local environmental data and tailoring solutions for a particular community or even for a particular city block, depending on the density of the community. So let's give an example. Recently we had 6 tornadoes go through the city of Ottawa. Emergency response came across on your phone, so that allowed people to be safe in their local community and to know that they perhaps should take shelter. You see this kind of use of data, which really wasn't developed for an environmental purpose, being applied to solutions to help local communities respond to that kind of a disaster situation. But it goes beyond that. Let's say in a home, in a particular room, maybe you have some children who have a particular health sensitivity to certain kinds of chemicals that might be in paints. Well, we're on the verge of having entrepreneurs develop solutions that you might be able to have a sensor in your phone or in a watch, perhaps, where you could tell that a particular chemical might be resident in a paint that you would have in a particular room and be off-gassing, and so then you could choose to remove that paint or whatever you have. So really, I think what I'm talking about is that entrepreneurs are thinking about how do you tailor environmental solutions right down to a room, a city block, a community, depending on what the local sustainable development or environmental need might be.
So good morning, everybody. And Jeff, I want to just thank Evergreen for all the work you do, and especially for convening these 2 days. It's been a great start already, and I'm sure it's going to continue that way. And I think already this morning we had an example from TD, an example of a meaningful contribution that a great private sector corporation is kind of making to our communities. And so the BDC, I think most of you may know what we do. We're a Crown Corporation. We lend and invest and advise small businesses. And my whole frame of reference for this question is around small business and entrepreneurs. And I think the one very concrete example I want to talk briefly about is this notion, which is increasingly important and increasingly beginning to define a lot of the startups and new businesses we see. And that is this idea of a purpose-driven company. And there's a guy called John Mackey. He used to be the CEO of Whole Foods, and I met with him once, and he was describing what a purpose-driven company is. And he used the analogy of red blood cells. And he says, we all have red blood cells. We need red blood cells to leave. If a red blood cell count goes low, we get weak. If the red blood cell count goes away, we die. And the business analogy is like profits. All companies need to have profits. Profits begin to suffer, the company gets weak, profits stop, the company dies. But no one confuses the purpose of life with red blood cells, and no one should confuse the purpose of business with profit. The purpose of a business is the difference it makes to society, and increasingly we're finding that more and more companies, they're often called B corporations, beneficial corporations, are emerging where it's not a question of having a kind of profit-driven entity with some CSR work at the corner of the desk. These companies are built from day one to make a difference. So they're contributing to a high-quality work environment, they're contributing to sustainable goals, they're contributing to creating opportunities for parts of the economy, parts of our population that's been left out. But from day one, they're designed not just to make money, but also to make a difference. And increasingly, this is what's defining the new generation of Canadian company.
Thank you, everyone. And Michael, I want to pick up on that point there. When you speak about purpose-driven companies or social enterprises or B Corps and their role, I want to take it in the specific lens of income inequality. And Desmond put that Three Cities map from David Hulchansky up, and the way in which it showed the presence of black folks in this city also mirrors the way in which our city is divided along income lines. Those areas, northwest and northeast, Toronto in particular, are where we see that high concentration of folks who are low income. But when people think about income inequality, we've heard a lot about this idea of an inclusive economy, that we can still have, shared prosperity. The economy can grow, but we can better kind of split the pie between different groups. Can you talk a little bit about the role for business in that specific aspect of building the city we dream of helping to kind of spread and share prosperity amongst a wider slice of the population?
And again, I'll answer that again through the lens of entrepreneurship, because I do think that and what's key is for people to take control of their destiny, and rather than doing their best to get employed by a larger company, take the steps required to start a business. And through that you can grow, you can hire the people you want to hire, etc. But it's hard. So I think what's the message I'd like people to think about here is, as a kind of community, is what can we do to support the emergence of entrepreneurs and entrepreneurships in parts of the population that are disadvantaged or excluded. So we have a number of things that we're doing currently that get at this, not as completely as I'd like, but get at this. So for example, women. I wouldn't say women are necessarily not part of the inclusive economy, but at the end of the day, only 15% of Canadian companies are led by women. That's an unacceptably low number. So we put in place a number of things around equity investment fund, around lending, around training, or mentorship to help address that. New immigrants to Canada. There are about 300,000 new immigrants to Canada per year. So over 5 years, just statistically, 50,000 of those new immigrants should be entrepreneurs, should be starting business. The reality is that doesn't happen, because these folks don't have access to the credit history, don't have access to the networks, don't have access to the mentors they need. So as a result, we and many other organizations are putting in place steps to make it much easier for these folks to establish themselves and set up businesses. Similarly with Indigenous entrepreneurs, et cetera. So I think it's a very important lens because the future of Canada really is about entrepreneurs and smaller businesses, helping these businesses grow. I think the more we can encourage inclusive growth to lead to new company creation on the part of these groups, the more sustainable and a more inclusive growth we're going to have.
Great, thank you. So building on that, Tabatha, I want to go a little deeper on this idea of inclusion, because there's many companies out there that have diversity policies, have diversity targets, and we know that key to inclusive growth is to really engage marginalized populations who currently are less engaged in the labor force, who are historically disadvantaged. But beyond just a diversity policy, what are some examples you've seen where companies are really creating inclusion, where they're creating spaces where folks who've been systematically marginalized can actually thrive in the workplace? Like what do we need to do that? What are the innovations, what are the collaborations that you see?
So I think Desmond said it well. We need to have the discussion and not be afraid to have the honest discussion about our history and where we've come from, and that there is segregation and there is definite gaps. So, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission came out with their 94 recommendations, and number 92 is really about corporate Canada, and it has 3 pieces to it. One is about having the discussion, education within your staff, not just we have an education program, you're welcome to come. It needs to be mandatory that we talk about the discussion and the segregation and where we are to build the cultural awareness. The second part is about employment, ensuring that we have employment practices, ensuring that we have flexible employment that meets the needs of various cultures. And the third is about procurement as well. So we have a program at CCAB called Progressive Aboriginal Relations, which we have about 95 companies that are undertaking that program, where the company sits down and they set out a mandate about how they're going to work with communities. And this is a specific program for Aboriginal communities. They set out a mandate. It's a 3-year process, a mandate around employment, around procurement, around their policies about cultural awareness and training. And then they have to put that into implementation. But you do see some really innovative companies coming forward, companies that are looking more into partnerships, are looking more into how they give back into mentorship programs. And those are companies that we go through and start to get awarded as a gold level par company. And we are starting to see that there are communities now who are growing and have large economic growth, and they're putting out RFPs and they're saying, well, you need to have this certification in order for us to work with you. So once we start to build that education and everyone is more aware, we're able to grow a lot faster.
Excellent, thank you. So Leah, let's talk about technology.
Just Kofi, before you go
please.
there, and I would add to this inclusion discussion in this way. So in addition to programs at SCTC, what we think about is leadership. And so our board of directors, we actively have recruited diverse points of view from across the country beyond geography, which is often what's thought of for a federal organization like ours. So for example, of our 15 board members, we have 2 First Nations leaders that are part of the board of directors. We have first generation Canadian and much other aspects of diversity across the 15. So I think in addition to programs, it's important for companies like ours to actively think about leadership and governance and making sure that voices are heard and thought about when we make decisions at the very senior levels. And that, of course, in addition then starts to extend down to your staff. So our staff is half women. We have, we're only 50 staff, so these might sound like not big numbers, but you have to have that context. I think we have 3 or 4 first-generation Canadians. And so really thinking actively about how do we bring in voices that can represent all of Canada in its entirety.
Excellent. Well, thank you for sharing that. So I want to kind of build on these themes, but with the angle now, Leah, of technology. Because we have folks that are techno-pessimists these days. They look at AI, they look at automation, and they say, this is just going to make things worse. This is just going to make our society more unequal. Many of these technologies may, in the short term, lead to us burning more fossil fuels, worse around our climate change goals. And some people are also techno-optimists, and they think we're going to solve every problem through technology. I'm wondering what your take is around technology and the role you see it playing in new startups and maybe even in bigger companies in actually making a difference around these issues of inclusion and specifically sustainability.
Well, I think I need to start by saying, as the head of a company called Sustainable Development Technology Canada, I'm obviously in the optimistic mind frame, and in fact, that's the way we try to think about our organization. So. What we do is hundreds of people from across the company that would have great ideas about how to change the world from an environmental perspective come to see us. And what our team tries to do, and this isn't always easy, but what we try to do is start from a position of yes, because ideas are really hard to translate into action, as we've already been talking about this morning. So, if you start from a position of no, it's really hard to get to yes after that. So in terms of technology, I have to say, as an optimist, that with data, AI, machine learning, all these things that are perhaps very topical in the press and weren't even a year ago, I have never been more positive actually about the future of sustainability and environment. Why? Why? Because all of those things that right now we have to measure ex post through third-party verification, all those things that we called externalities before, all of a sudden, with the proper governance, with the proper oversight, and with proper transparency, we'll be able to think about holistically, have information to make informed decisions, and then be more thoughtful in the paths that we choose. And then we won't find out 3 years later that we made a mistake. I'll give you an example. Just recently, you probably saw that we found out 3 years after the fact that a factory outside of Canada was cheating on emissions of refrigerants, which caused another hole in the ozone layer. We thought we were done with that years ago, right? But here we go. We have another hole in the ozone layer, and we find out 3 years later, which scientists are able to trace back after the fact. But enforcement and correction of that problem is very difficult 3 years ex post. Now, not in the very distant future, we'll be able to know that that problem happened almost instantaneously and be able to take action. And that really makes me positive. And as in my first comments, you should be able to deliver that down to local community, local city block, all those things as time goes on with proper governance and oversight.
So I have a question for all of you that's come to mind as you've been speaking, and it's around kind of short-term thinking versus long-term thinking. Because you spoke about externalities and this idea that, it seems one of the reasons that business hasn't been as transformative is there's tons of pressure from shareholders and just from the reality of keeping the lights on to have short-term thinking, to think about what's going to give me profit in the short term. But if we're talking about pathways that you both spoke on to bring marginalized people into leadership or into your organization, if we're talking about, spending the money to invest in those innovative new technologies, it seems there's a degree of long-term thinking required. Do you see a culture shift in that way? Do you see more openness in business to long-term thinking? Was that always there, but it's been misrepresented? I'm just wondering where you see that kind of perspective from leadership around the short and long term playing a role in building these solutions.
Do you want me to go first?
Yeah, please.
So I think, the two-part answer. First is, again, in our world, we're working with entrepreneurs and SMEs. The vast majority of these companies are privately owned. And the vast majority of entrepreneurs want to build their companies to last so they can pass them on to the next generation. So basically, my whole world is full of companies that are full of entrepreneurs, business leaders who are thinking long-term and thinking multi-generational, and as a result can do the types of things you were describing in terms of creating longer-term momentum and opportunities for growth. On the publicly traded side of things, again, it's hard to generalize. I think a lot of very, very successful companies have been successful for a long time, and part of their strategic and operational thinking is longer term. So short-termism is clearly a problem, because here we're talking about a set of challenges that are long-term in nature. So you need a long-term perspective to tackle them. But again, I think the entrepreneurship sector in this country does think and function that way, and is a real source of solution when it comes to these pretty intense challenges we face in a lot of our urban centers.
Okay, so for one of the closing questions, I want to think ahead. I think many people here today most likely have children. I've got a 4-year-old at home. She's just started in the school system, which brings its joys and some of its struggles for those who've gone through that. But when I think about the future that she is going to be a part of, about the city of the future, there's obviously lots of concerns, but I want us to move and kind of end in a hopeful direction. If we get this all right, if we truly build the cities and have the economies that deal with these challenges of the 21st century, if we're thinking 25 years from now, in 2043, tell us, what would that city look like? What would it be like to work in that city, to live, to be part of the economy in that city of our dreams that actually is able to accomplish these goals? Maybe leave us on a hopeful note. What projecting would that look like to you, and what would it be like to be part of that city? And that's for everyone.
So I'll start. So again, the cities will be kind of vibrant in terms of job creation, growing companies, etc. But what excites me is, I think what's going to define these companies is their purpose. And they're going to be companies that succeed because they're selling things that customers want to buy. Customers are going to know where the ingredients come from. They're not going to see a lot of plastic. The customers are going to know the work practices are good. They're going to be places where employees want to work, because these companies are targeting a kind of higher purpose and doing something meaningful that excites people to work there. And as a result, investors are going to invest because they have companies that have sticky customers and companies that have loyal employees. You're not going to find a better investment equation than that. And my future is one where Toronto, cities in Canada are defined by companies like this.
I think I take this question this way. In May this year, we convened so SDTC has, as I said, 120 companies under management. We brought together all these CEOs in May with our board of directors, and we had a panel on future cities, just similar as you're having a whole day. And one of the CEOs there is a gentleman named Curtis McBride. He runs a company called MyoVision here in this region, and they're trying to transform the way we think about traffic in communities like this one, but smaller ones as well. It's in the Kitchener-Waterloo area. And, he said, I'd like to reframe it a bit in that, when we have big debates like this about what's the future of our city, it's really up to us to imagine, and we have to remember that we have control. Because right now, we are convening dialogues because I think, if you think about some of the debates that are going on about the future of cities, and particularly in this city with Sidewalk Labs that's been in the paper quite recently, we sometimes feel that things have gone beyond our control, right? But it's really up to us to envision. So how do we use the technologies for good? And a great follow-up comment that came after it, another panelist member said, years ago we made choices. We made choices that we would have green space as we would like them to be. We made choices that you wouldn't, and I'm going to go beyond just environment here, but that we wouldn't sell, certain kinds of, we wouldn't sell certain kinds of products in schools. We made choices that we would make available certain kinds of housing shared across different regions. These are choices we made historically, and cities actually have that power. They have the regulatory power, they have the convening power. So what I would say is, something that we need to remember is that this is about a dialogue that starts with the citizens and the public realm, and that's what we build things on. And I would say even capitalism. If you go back to the beginning of capitalism and entrepreneurship, often people will quote Adam Smith. Adam Smith didn't write one book. He wrote 2 books. The other book had a title related to moral sentiments. His whole history, he talked about that book, not the one about capitalism. So remember, every institution, including entrepreneurship and capitalism, starts from the way society would like to define it. And I think sometimes when we get into these short-term, long-term decisions and concerns about how business might function today, we forget that it's an institution that we created a long time ago, and that it started from a moral choice basis, or a social basis is what we would call it today, a civil society basis, what we would call it today, that we chose, not that happened to us.
So I have 2 boys as well, and I think the future is about our youth. It's about educating our youth. And I'm hopeful that our city in 25 years has leadership that is our youth today, that's educated about all the various cultures and minorities in the city and across the country. And we don't have to have requirements around diversity on boards, and we don't have to have requirements around procurement percentages from marginalized businesses or diverse businesses in communities. That becomes a norm, starts to become a norm, and I think that really has to do with the youth of today and what we're teaching them today. My children don't see a difference in their classmates that other people see, or that us as adults see. So I think for me it's about the leadership, and in order to get there, we're really going to need to get to a more consistent place in our leadership. It's very hard to look long term when your leadership and their policies are so decisive and divisive, and we're constantly flipping between where our leadership sits.
Thank you. So I'd like to thank you all. We heard about purpose. We heard about the transformative potential of data. We heard about the need to think of youth. We heard about leadership. But one thing that really strikes me was Leah spoke about control. And I love that concept. I actually was doing a talk a couple weeks ago with those same David Helchansky charts, and talked about segregation in our city versus in the US. In the US, it was very purposeful. They had policies like redlining, which led to a segregated city. And I said, sometimes in Toronto, we try to say that our segregation was natural. That when something happens through the market, we make it feel like it's a force of nature, something outside of our control. You know, the wind just blew in the direction of inequality, and that's where we are. But I love this idea and leaving us with this thought that actually we control the market, we control the economy, and I hope we all go away for the rest of this 48 hours of speaking together, recognizing that control and influence we have to build the city of our dreams. Thank you.